All right, so this is part 3 of our lecture. This is a female reproductive system. So we are starting with Roman numeral 2 in your outline, and we're going to start looking at the female reproductive tract. This is the mid-sagittal diagram, and you should know everything on here. So the, except for, I take that back, I don't really talk about this, the pouches here, so you don't need to worry about those two, but everything else, yes. All right, so we're going to start looking at our ovaries. So the woman has 2 ovaries, and the ovaries are the gonads. So this is where the eggs are produced and where meiosis occurs. And then when they're produced, the ova will be transported. They'll ovulate, which means that they're going to break through the wall of the ovary, and they're going to be released into basically the outside of the ovary, and they're caught most of the time with these finger-like little projections of our uterine tube. So the uterine tube is also oftentimes called the fallopian tube, and so this uterine tube will take the egg or the ovum and pass it and move it towards the uterus. The uterus is where, if the egg is fertilized, will implant along the wall. The inner wall or the inner lining of the uterus is called the endometrium. So the fertilized egg will implant into the endometrium, and that was where the embryo and then fetus will develop. The very opening of the uterus is called the cervix, and this is what opens up during labor. So this tiny opening will, because of the smooth muscle, the myometrium of the uterus, contractions of labor are basically to open this cervix. And you can see kind of how thick this cervix is as it projects into the vagina. This becomes very thin with those labor contractions, thin enough for the head of the baby to fit through. And then there's the vagina that allows the baby to come out. Okay, and of course we have our external genitalia. So let's start looking at the picture of the female reproductive tract like this. So in your outline, we can see that there are the 2 ovaries here, and they're suspended. So the ovaries are kind of hanging or suspended in the pelvic cavity with these soft tissue structures. So let's take a look at structures stabilizing the ovary. So this is the ovarian ligament, this ligament here, right? So ovarian ligament's pretty generic. It's a ligament that runs from the uterus to the ovary. The mesovarium, this structure here, is just a continuation of the broad ligament. So when you look at this broad ligament, it's ligament is not it's a misnomer, because this tissue is not ligament. It's not dense, regular connective tissue like the ones that connect your bone to bone. However, it's called ligament. It's just a soft membrane, but it runs completely over the uterus. So just think about a blanket kind of covering everything. It does not stop at the edge, as it kind of might look like in this picture. But this broad ligament also expands over here and attaches to this fallopian tube or uterine tube. So this portion is called the mesovarium. So this is going to anchor the ovary and stabilize it to the uterine tube. And then we have another ligament here called the suspensory ligament. So this suspensory ligament is going to attach the ovary to the lateral walls of our pelvic cavity. Okay, so that's going to stabilize the ovaries so they don't twist inside of our body, and they're going to limit the side-to-side or rotational movement. If you want to take a look at the ovaries, externally and internally, and then oogenesis, let's go ahead and take a look at that. So this is our ovary diagram when it's cut open. And the ovary, if you see it, number 1, it has the tunica albuginea, a fibrous capsule. Tunica albuginea should sound really familiar because that also covered the testis. So that's not actually labeled here in this picture. Let me see if it's actually here. No. Well, if you look at the outside of the ovary, it will be covered with this tunica albuginea. All right, so internally, let's look at the internal structures. The outer portion is going to be called the cortex of the ovary. The inner portion is called the medulla. Okay, the cortex is what develops the oocytes and eventually matures the ovum. So there are stages that we're going to go through in the maturation process of the oocytes to the mature ovum. This is a picture of ovulation. So ovulation literally releases the oocyte outside of the ovary. And then there are structures that are created after it happens. So this is a really cool picture of ovulation, right? So we can see that there's substances that surround our oocyte. If you look inside, there's a very sort of bright circular structure here, and that's going to be the ovum or secondary oocyte. It's within the corona radiata. So the larger ball here is going to be called the corona radiata. We'll talk about that. Okay, so oogenesis is the process of creating the egg, right, or the ovum. And let's take a look at that process. So it's a little bit more complicated than what's going on in the male, because as you can see here, you have these structures called follicles, and follicles are structures that house the developing oocyte. So they're a collection of cells that protect and secrete substances that enhance the development of our oocyte. So the oocyte is inside, it's this little guy here, but then we can see the follicle itself can actually change throughout the stages of the maturation process. So let's take a look at that. All right, so let's look at the follicular phase. The follicular phase is, so I do have a picture of a woman's monthly cycle, her menstrual cycle, and there are different aspects that all kind of cycle together. When you're developing the ovum has two phases. One is called the follicular phase, and the other one's called the luteal phase. So if you look at your outline, I do have follicular phase first, and then if you move down, I have the luteal phase. It will be obvious when it changes over, because ovulation is what's going to change it over, but let's talk about what's going on in the follicular phase. So the follicular phase is maturing the follicle. So you still have a follicle, and the follicle is changing, as well as the oocyte is changing inside the follicle. So when, and the difference also, one big difference between oogenesis and spermatogenesis is that oogenesis takes place in utero. So a baby, a female fetus inside the womb is creating the eggs already, whereas for a male, the spermatogenesis process does not happen until puberty. Okay, so it's very different. All right, so inside the cortex of the ovary, we're going to have a lot. The female, a female woman, or not a woman, but a fetus, right, will actually have many primordial follicles. So her ovaries are going to have way more primordial follicles containing oocytes than she'll ever need in her life. She'll never ovulate as many that she has. So you have this huge collection of primordial oocytes within a primordial follicle. So how you recognize, so you guys are going to be able to, or going to need to be able to recognize the different follicles stages in a histology slide. So we're going to go over this one. So the hallmark of a sign of a primordial follicle is simple squamous wall. So there's just one layer of cells around the oocyte here. So primordial follicles are simple squamous cells. They contain a primary oocyte. Many will mature into the primary follicle. Okay, so the primary follicle, so this is our first stage. A collection of these, not all of them, will mature into our primary follicle. So a primary follicle is slightly different because the cells that are surrounding, that are forming the follicle, are going to be cuboidal, or they can start to stratify. Okay, so you either have this scenario here where it's cuboidal, so you can see that they're flat here. At least this one nucleus is very obvious, it's flat. Now we have cuboidal cells, so this is a primary follicle. We still have the oocyte developing here. So the primary follicle is going to start to secrete estrogen. So if you're wondering where estrogen and progesterone are secreted, those are the two female hormones. Those are created in the ovary. So let me show you the next two slides so we can take a look at these two follicles so far. So this is a primordial follicle. So where are we? We're in the cortex of our ovary. Here is our oocyte that we can see, this round structure, and then the follicle itself, right, is the larger container for this oocyte, and that's our follicular cell, and we know it's primordial because they're all flat and squamous in shape. When you look at a primary follicle, right, primordial is different than primary. Primary follicles, you can see that we still have a small space. The cells here are larger, taller, cuboidal. And then we're moving on to secondary follicles. So a secondary follicle is going to be larger, it's going to be stratified, and you'll start to see spaces. This is not the most obvious, but there's going to be spaces that are starting to open up between the cells of the follicle, because there's a fluid that's being made called follicular fluid that's going to create sort of build up within the secondary follicle. Let's look at the cartoon of it, right? So this is our secondary follicle. So we can see that the follicle itself is larger, and we have these openings, these spaces that are going to be filled with follicular fluid, okay? So don't worry about the word granulosa cells. We'll just keep this the follicle. And so our secondary follicle will then mature into the last stage, which is called a Graafian or tertiary follicle. Here's our tertiary follicle, and you can recognize a tertiary follicle because all of these smaller spaces that have been filled with follicular fluid will coalesce into one really large space. This one really large space is going to be called the antrum, okay? And it always looks like this, looks like a little croissant, and it's very, large, the antrum. The oocyte at this stage, at the very last, most mature stage, is called the secondary oocyte. And we'll go through the oogenesis in just a second, but you should know that the secondary oocyte is the most mature stage that we have here, and the secondary oocyte is what's ovulated. Now, we can also see some structures that are on top of our secondary oocyte, this corona radiata. The corona radiata is a collection of cells. You can see they're granulosa cells. The collection of cells here that will remain attached to the secondary oocyte after ovulation. So these cells go with the ovum. So if I ask you for what this structure is in a tertiary follicle, you can say secondary oocyte, that's the preferred answer. Ovum is okay, but the secondary oocyte is what you should answer. So the corona radiata is going to stay with the secondary oocyte after it's matured. So looking at our nice tertiary oocyte, right? So this is going to be a huge antrum. So you can see the word here. Here is our corona radiata, the collection of cells that stay with our oocyte. This should be secondary oocyte, right? And then there's another structure here called the zona pellucida. So the zona pellucida, you can see in this light purple. This is a clear, this is stained purple, but in real life it's clear. So it's a clear band of molecules. So this is going to be glycoproteins. It's going to cover the oocyte itself. So, and it's to protect the oocyte. When sperm come in and try to fertilize this ovulated secondary oocyte, the sperm has to go through the corona radiata, and then it has to go through the zona pellucida. So that's what the acrosome does for the sperm. The acrosome releases its enzymes because there are a couple layers, the corona radiata and zona pellucida, before it hits that secondary oocyte. Okay, so let's take a look at ovulation. So this is a picture of ovulation. This is the release of the secondary oocyte. So if you look at number 4 in your outline, this is mediated by a surge in luteinizing hormone. And the secondary oocyte is released. It contains number 1, the zona pellucida, which is that band of glycoprotein, and number 2, the corona radiata, which is the granulosa cells that are still attached to the secondary oocyte upon ovulation. So what you're looking at here, this is the ovary wall, this sort of fleshy colored thing. The red portion is the area where ovulation is happening. So there's a blood here that's causing it to be red. Then you can see the yellow structure, right? The yellow structure kind of coming out of that area. So this is going to be our basically the corona radiata, and then inside the corona radiata you'll have the oocytes. It's protected. And there it is. So this is human ovulation. I know the picture is pretty grainy, but it wasn't until 2008 that they found an actual human. They videoed human ovulation. They could probably find video of other animals ovulating, but they had no idea how long it took for a human to ovulate. And so you can read this, about 15 minutes to finish in this procedure. And this is funny because this woman went in for a hysterectomy. So she was getting her reproductive organs removed, and they found her ovulating during the procedure. All right. So let's talk about what's happening. Here's our oogenesis, right? So just like the male, we have stem cells, right? The stem cells are called oogonium. Remember that the sperm stem cells are called spermatogonium, so the same word, oogonium. The oogonium is diploid, and it can replace itself to make more stem cells, or it can undergo meiosis. So we have the primary oocyte produced, right? We have the primary oocyte undergoing meiosis 1. So this is what's interesting, and this is what you should remember as well. When this primary oocyte undergoes meiosis 1, you do create a secondary oocyte and a polar body. So if you remember when cells split, right, you make 2 cells, but in oogenesis, only 1 cell in that split is going to get the cytoplasm. It gets the lion's share of the cytoplasm. It gets the organelles. It gets the nutrients. And the second cell becomes something called a polar body, or it is, that's what it's called. It's called the polar body. And it just contains the leftover chromosomes that are not going to be used in the actual gamete. So there's only going to be 1 gamete produced through both meiotic divisions, because the second time we undergo meiosis, right, after meiosis 2, we create another polar body and 1 ovum. So if you and so the ovum here, you're going to be your secondary oocyte, okay? And the polar body is actually still contained within the secondary oocyte. Let's take a look at the side-by-side comparison. So here's our spermatogenesis on one side, oogenesis on the other side. So the spermatogonium and oogonium, those are our stem cells that are diploid. They're going to mature into primary cells, spermatocyte and oocyte. The primary cells will undergo meiosis 1 to produce the secondary cells. Now, here's the difference, right? When after meiosis 1, you have 2 fully functional cells. After meiosis 1, you only have 1 functional cell, then you create a polar body. After meiosis 2, you have 4. So both of these cells undergo meiosis 2. You have 4 gametes, 4 spermatids, and then they undergo differentiation. Remember, this was called spermiogenesis to create your spermatozoa. For the female, you have that 1 oocyte made secondary oocyte. It undergoes meiosis 2. You still only have 1 ovum. You create a second solar body. Okay, and so you really just have that 1 gamete. So for the same amount of energy, the same meiosis 1 and meiosis 2 process, males will produce 4 gametes, whereas females will only produce 1. And if you talk to evolutionary biologists, they'll say that this reason is sort of the reason why there's a female choosiness in the animal kingdom, because it's just so much more expensive meaning cellular energy expensive to produce an egg than it is to produce sperm, because you can get so many more sperm from that same sort of cost of meiosis. And also, of course, the females are going to gestate the developing embryo and fetus, and so it's very, very costly. So for the female, she gets to be choosy, right, because their bodies are putting in more energy into reproduction. Okay, so let's take a look at our next topic here. actually I want to take a look at the luteal phase now. So let's go back. Okay, so after ovulation, we are releasing the secondary oocyte. We still have the corona radiata on top of it. And now what happens to these cells that were once part of the follicle? They don't go away immediately. They're going to become something called the corpus luteum. Okay, so you see the luteal phase. When you have ovulation, this is going to divide the follicular phase, so the phase of the woman's cycle where she's creating the sort of maturing the follicle. That's the follicular phase. Ovulation changes that into the luteal phase. So these two structures here are found in the luteal phase. Corpus luteum, okay, that's why it's called the luteal phase, is these cells are now going to be secreting a lot of progesterone. So you're going to get an uptick in progesterone production. And progesterone is a really great hormone name because it's pro-gestation. So if a woman is going to be able to gestate, the endometrium lining, the lining of the uterus, has to be very, very thick. It has to have a lot of blood vessels going to it everywhere, because you never know where that fertilized egg is going to implant. And so the entire lining has to be very thick, very nutritive, and very rich with blood supply. So this progesterone is going to give that endometrium the message to remain thick. Now, if the woman is not pregnant, this corpus luteum is going to degenerate, right? So after a certain amount of days, this corpus luteum will degenerate. And the degenerated form is going to be called the corpus albicans. So the corpus albicans is not active. It's basically just kind of like scar tissue that is going to be in the ovary, and it signifies basically a round of ovulation. Okay, so you can see that's degenerated a corpus luteum. It's small, white, and inactive in the ovary. Okay, so let's take a look at this image now. This is a little bit later on in the PowerPoint, but this is the phases of basically the female reproductive cycle. It looks at hormone levels. It looks at the hormone levels that are coming from your brain, the follicular stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. It has the stages that's happening in the ovary. It has the hormones produced by the ovary, which are the estrogens and progesterones. We're not going to talk about inhibin right now. And then it has also overlapping with that what's happening in the uterus, right? So a woman's reproductive system is very controlled by hormones. So the hormones are going to have a big impact on what's going on in the ovary and also what's going on in the uterus. So here's what you should be able to understand. The follicular phase, right? If you look at that, we have half of the woman's cycle. So if you look at the days here, this is that sort of average 28-day cycle. This obviously is variable with women. Some women have longer cycles, some women have shorter cycles, but this is on average. So in the first half of those 28 days, you have the follicular phase happening. And what ends that follicular phase at, in the middle is ovulation. So this is what really changes that follicular phase to the luteal phase. And if you look at what we talked about so far, right, the follicular phase is follicular development, ovulation happens, then we have the corpus luteum forming, which is going to kick off the luteal phase, and then at the end we have the corpus albicans, which is our degenerated corpus luteum. Now I want you to look at the hormone levels here. Let's just look at progesterone, okay? So the progesterone levels are really low when the oocyte is developing, because remember, what does progesterone do? Progesterone maintains a very thick endometrial lining. So if you look at what happens here, right after ovulation, remember the corpus luteum, I just mentioned that the corpus luteum is going to kick out a lot of progesterone. So look at the progesterone levels shoot up after we hit that luteal phase, because this is now producing a lot of progesterone. When this rises, look what's happening at the uterine level, right? So the uterine lining, that endometrium, is getting thicker and thicker and thicker in response to the level of progesterone. Now, at the end of the cycle, the woman is not pregnant, all right? We're assuming she's not pregnant. The level of progesterone, as this corpus luteum degenerates, okay, it doesn't live forever. It's going to become the corpus albicans. This is inactive, so look what level happens to the level of progesterone. It drops dramatically, all right? We're not making progesterone anymore. What happens to the lining of the uterus? It is shed. So you're losing this functional layer. We'll look at, there's two layers. The functional layer of the endometrium is lost. And so this is what the menses, or a woman's period, the blood that is lost and the tissue that's lost is this layer of the endometrium, okay, of the uterine wall. So then you kind of sort of start to rebuild the next cycle, all right? So I'm not going to worry about estrogens. We don't need to worry about inhibin, but the progesterone should make lots of sense because the progesterone is made predominantly by the corpus luteum, okay? Now, I also want you guys to look at this huge spike. This is mentioned in your outline too. What signals ovulation is a very large spike in luteinizing hormone. So you see that's low, there's a huge spike in it, and then it's low again. So this hormone is just produced by the brain, is going to trigger ovulation. And then if there's ovulation kits over the counter that you can get if you're trying to get pregnant, and they actually look for this rise in luteinizing hormone. Also, your body temperature rises. I'm sure some of you guys knew that too. The sort of your metabolic rate, your temperature kind of kicks up a little bit around ovulation as well. So you can take a temperature and know if you're going to be ovulating. So that's it. So for this region here, know that luteinizing hormone spikes, that kicks off ovulation. For this, and then also know, right, follicular development happens in the follicular phase. The luteal phase is where you have the corpus luteum and corpus albicans. In the ovary, the hormones, I told you not to worry about estrogens and inhibin, but just look at progesterone, and this should match up with the formation of the corpus luteum. Progesterone has a role directly on the uterine lining, where when it's low, you're not really building up the uterine lining that much, but when it kicks up, you're really enlarging that uterine lining to prepare for receiving the fertilized egg. And when the progesterone levels fall, a woman is not pregnant, then and the corpus luteum degenerates, then you have the initiation of menstruation, where you're losing that functional layer of the endometrium, and everything starts over again. All right, so that's what you want to understand. Let's go back and look at a couple things. Okay, actually we're done, but I thought I'd end up with this really fun dress that someone made out of a print that has basically ovary histology. So if you look, these are just the little follicles and then the oocytes inside the follicles. All right, so I'll stop here.